Good morning.
We're going to start with a little introduction, talking about, just tell us who you are and your affiliation with Detroit, with this organization and with this project, just to get it going.
Yes, thank you. I'm Akosua Barthwell Evans. I'm a native Detroiter. My parents both came up from the South as part of the Great Migration. And my father, of course, was a very successful businessman. He had 13 drugstores, which is the largest number that any African American has ever owned in the country, and an ice cream company. My mother was a school teacher and very active. And I returned from Wall Street to Detroit in 2005 to restore the home I grew up in and also to start my company. I'm very proud to be a member of the board of the Detroit Historical Society and have been active in the community for many years.
Tell me a little bit about, your family and the size of your family, and timestamp some of that a bit about your father's business.
Okay. So my father came to Detroit in about 1922, and he would have been around 16 at the time. He came from a small town in Georgia, Cordele, Georgia, where there were no public schools for African Americans. But his role model was a gentleman, an African American gentleman who was a pharmacist. So he decided as a young boy to be a pharmacist. Because there were no public schools, he went to a church school, which was burned down, so he had no records. So when he came here, with the help of a cousin, he went to Cass Tech. He went to what was then City College, which is now Wayne State University, became a pharmacist, but didn't have a job opportunity as a pharmacist. Was told that if he worked in this store and filled the prescriptions, that the white clients would feel uneasy. So he was a pharmacist, but worked more or less like a stock boy. However, the business had some problems. He was able to buy them out, and he built the chain of stores. And what was most famous in Detroit was he had an ice cream company that probably had about 20 flavors. It was distributed in his stores and for social events. So he became known for the business. He was active, head of the Booker T. Washington Business Association. He was on the Michigan Retail Pharmacists Association. He was on the Wayne State Alumni Board. And when the Constitutional Convention was convened for the state of Michigan, he ran and was elected and served on the Judiciary Committee. My mother came from Greensboro. Her uncle was the president of Bennett College for Women, and her other uncle was the first bishop in the Methodist Church. So she had a very educated background. She got a master's from Michigan, and that's where she met my father. And she was president of the Delta sorority for 2 years, very active in the community. And so they believed very much in community. They believed in education, and were very proud of who they were. As you know, Bob, I integrated Kingswood School Cranbrook. I was the first African American there, not known to me that I was doing that, and proud that I graduated in the top 5 academically and was the president of the student council.
That's great. Tell me your recollection of, or your observations growing up as your father was growing that business, and where, I guess I'm interested, where were the stores located, and what were perhaps barriers or non-barriers that he faced in establishing that, what sounded like a very successful business?
Well, the very first store was on Russell and Alger, and the headquarters was on Oakland and Hague. What was remarkable, I think, is he had no MBA, and he kind of learned through observation. At the time, the largest chain in Detroit was Cunningham's. He would visit those stores. Every year, we would go to New York, and he would visit stores there. And I think it was a lot of learning by doing, not really having formal training. His accountant originally was my mother, and he quickly fired her. But his first real accountant was Richard Austin, who was the first African-American CPA in the state of Michigan and later the Secretary of State. And he did an excellent job. But I think, he had to learn a lot of things. Some of the people that worked for him had various levels of experience working, so it was not just this is how you ring a cash register or this is how you do that, but this is how you greet customers, this is how we're going to serve. He was very formal and respectful, so everyone was called by their surname and courtesy title, and so was he. And he took a lot of pride in the business. One of the things I found out later, and I actually wrote an article about it, was Detroit had a community of supporting African American businesses. So at Bethel AME Church, the minister's wife, Fannie Peck, started an organization called the Housewives League. So these were African American women who would meet, and they would keep score of how much were you spending in black-owned businesses. There was something else called the Nakarima Club. They would give awards for the best run and the cleanest African-American businesses. So you had a lot of support, and Detroit, certainly in the 30s and perhaps up until the time of the riots, had more African-American-owned businesses than any place in the United States. So I grew up with not only my father's business, but there was also a hotel called the Gotham Hotel, which was multi-storied, had a lobby filled with oil portraits by Huey Lee Smith of prominent leaders. Everyone would go there for Sunday dinner with waiters with the white jackets, all that. The Diggs family owned several funeral homes. The Allen family owned grocery stores. So Detroit was bustling with various African American businesses, and there was a lot of community among those businessmen. They would meet every Thursday at the Lucy Thurman Y and talk about their issues, what could they do. One was financing. So my father and others started something called the Victory Loan, and I think it was called Victory Loan and Savings, which was a source of capital for these businesses, because many times their capital sources was just borrowing from each other.
Were in his businesses and these businesses you referenced, were the customers, were the clientele African American?
They were mainly African American because even though there might not have been de jure segregation, there was de facto segregation. So even though my father was successful, he told me that he couldn't always buy stores in neighborhoods where he would want to. His concept of a drugstore is much different than what we know today. So he had the ice cream company, but there weren't that many places apparently where African Americans could go and have a casual meal. And so his stores all had soda fountains, some of them had booths, and people would come after church and have their Sunday dinner. You could pay your electric bill. He sold a lot of toys, full line of cosmetics. So they were like general stores, and he trained a lot of pharmacists. That was a place where they could get their training that they needed. So there was a sense of there was black communities. They weren't confined to one area, and then gradually people could move. We were the second African Americans on our block on West Boston Boulevard, and we grew up next door to the Levin family, as in Carl Levin, and we remain friends today. But the Boston Edison, at the time I was going to Kingswood, of these historic districts like Indian Village, Palmerwood, Sherwood Forest, that was the only one where African Americans could live when I was growing up.
So what happened to the stores? What happened to your dad's?
So the stores, after about, I would say in the late 50s, failed, except he kept one. Just the lack of capital. There was, frankly, a lot of pilferage and things like that. And I think it was difficult for him to compete both in terms of prices for the goods with the larger stores, and also probably didn't have the best systematic management to monitor what was always going on there. And I think the other thing was, as there was more integration, the clientele that might have come in to kind of purchase merchandise or eat there had a lot of other choices. And so that kind of died out. He kept the last store until my brother and I entered law school, and that was in Southwest Detroit.
So what do you, so that's a great history and great
Mhm.
basis there. So what do you recall in where was your family living in the 60s, and what do you recall the environment in Detroit back then?
Well, my family, their first home was on Trowbridge, and their second home was on West Boston Boulevard, which is where I am still today. So they were the second owners of that home, and that's where they lived. And growing up, it was a beautiful neighborhood, lined with elm trees, very nice homes, and a vibrant community, and a neighborhood that was integrated, but was evolving to become predominantly African American. But there were, east of the Lodge Freeway, it was more predominantly white, and west there was greater integration, but it was not predominantly black, but it was moving that way. So what I recalled was we had a very vibrant community and social life. So we saw, as a young child, I saw beautiful women, successful men and women, a lot of role models. Really felt like the best role models were right in my community. And there was a lot of cooperation. I mean, obviously there are always schisms, but one thing was we had and still have the largest event called the Freedom Fund Dinner for the NAACP. And if I'm not mistaken, that was started in Detroit by two doctors who were reacting, I think it was to a lynching in Ohio or something like that. But people gave. My father subsidized with Walton Lewis, if you know David Baker Lewis, his father, baseball teams in the community. They supported the Y. There was a lot of, so there was a strong sense, from my perspective, of giving back to the community. My father was always very proud of who he was. I found recently that he had funded a lecture by W.E.B. Du Bois when he came to Detroit. Now, this contrasted when I went to Kingswood, where I was the only black that I really saw for 4 years at Kingswood. So even the domestic staff, the groundspeople, none of them was black. And I think what amazed me, there were blacks at Cranbrook, the Thomases, Salisburys, and then my brother and Tommy Love, but there was no knowledge that there was this kind of black middle class and upper class community among my classmates.
Mm-hmm.
But and there was quite a lot of resistance from the administration about me coming. But fortunately, my parents never told me any of this. So I didn't know, and my classmates were open-minded, and so I was elected to the student council in my first year. But I think it struck me that there was this divide, both academically and socially, so that that really spearheaded my interest in African American history. So when I went to college at Barnard, I began collecting first edition books by African American authors as well as paintings by African American artists. And I became aware that a lot of our history was just really not known, and I was kind of amazed by that.
The that's really it's just kind of interesting to me, as an African American living on West Boston Boulevard and going to Kingswood, that is not what most people observe is the average experience for
Right.
African Americans in Detroit. And I drove to the Detroit Golf Club yesterday down Hamilton, and you saw this stark contrast once you get onto Pontchartrain. How does just more just curiosity? How do you react to that? How do you deal with that? And how? What do you think we can? I just react to that.
Okay. So there could be two questions in that. One question could be, how do we deal with the fact that in a community that represents underserved people, such as the African American community, that there are still, quote, class differences? So there are people, as we know, in Detroit living in abject poverty. And there are others, African Americans, who are senior corporate executives, own successful businesses, are professionals, and they live elsewhere. So they're at a different level economically. But I think that one thing that unites us might be, even though whatever you achieve, you're still going to face discrimination in some level. So I could tell you a couple of anecdotes. So one of the things that I think caused that class that I'm talking about to be very resentful at the time of 67 was something started, and I don't have the exact name, but it was something, I think it was stress or something. It basically meant that police had the opportunity to stop people that were, quote, suspicious without a warrant. And I remember one of the people they stopped was a dentist, Dr. Wendell Cox, who was one of the founders of WCHB and WJZZ, the radio stations, which were the second African-American-owned stations in the country. They stopped him as he was getting out of his car in his driveway on Chicago Boulevard. And he was a very well-dressed man. So these kind of incidents were happening that really enraged the African American community. I'm talking about more polite, stopping someone in the driveway. I don't really know what happened, but I would imagine when they found out who it was like, oh, sorry, Dr. Cox. But we also know that if you were just an average black young man, you were probably treated much differently with more brutality. So I think that there was this consciousness and awareness, and that was something my family always had. And I remember going to dinner at a physician's home, who will remain anonymous, and the physician said to my dad, Sid, I'm so glad the police are stopping these, and he used the word, N-word. And my father turned to him and said, I won't say his first name, but what do you think you are? So there was always this sense of community. When my father was at CONCON, Constitutional Convention, there was a movement not to seat Coleman Young on the grounds that he was accused of having communist ties. And at the time, my father was pretty well respected and a businessman. And so he threatened to have a press conference if that took place. And I forgot, there was some Republican that he was going to expose or something. So that didn't take place about Coleman Young, and all of their lives, Coleman Young remained a friend of my father's. So when we set up the scholarship fund I was talking to you about at Wayne State, both Coleman Young and Dennis Archer were the honorary co-chairs, and Coleman Young was sick at the time, but he always respected my father, and I think that that the way I was brought up, when I went to Kingswood, I did not feel kind of intimidated or threatened. And I remember the wife of a very prominent GE executive came up to me and said, "Oh, I'm so glad you're in my daughter's class." And I said, "Thank you," but I thought to myself, well, why wouldn't you be? So I had a confidence that I think came
Yeah.
from a family that was proud of who they were, but who really didn't think they were better than other people. So I remember when my mom came to visit at Kingswood one day, we were walking down the hall, and the housekeeper was not black, but she just said, "Good morning, how are you?" And I said, "Mom, no one speaks to the housekeeper." She said, "I speak to everybody." And so there was just this sense of respect for
Yeah.
people,
That's great.
regardless of station, and wanting very much to see the community uplifted. And my father was always proud of others' success. So when we were very close to the Gordy families. So when Berry Gordy was starting Motown, he apparently came to my father and asked his advice. And my father, encouraged him, was always proud of that success, and even said that his biggest mistake was not saying, "Take me with you."
Yeah.
And one of my cousins, who couldn't read music, went to work over there and was given the job as a courtesy to our family, but went on to write all the songs for the Temptations, heard it on the grapevine, wrote "Papa Was a Rolling Stone," and became Norman Whitfield, became a very well-known producer.
Mhm, sure.
So there was this sense of community.
Yeah, yeah, clearly.
And I would say that today, I'm not so sure if we have that same community. I'm in an organization, as you know, Executive Leadership Council. So we visited Atlanta, and the mayor spoke, and he talked about the fact of how elders, like an Andy Young, other people like that, kind of keep politicians in check. So if you do something that's not really perceived as overall beneficial to the community, you're going to get a phone call, and you're going to respect that. Ingrid Saunders Jones, another one.
Just met her.
Yeah, we grew up together.
Oh, really? We should talk about
Yeah.
her separately. I've got a picture with her. She was here the other night.
Yeah, she's like that too. So a strong sense of what can I do to help others, and really not fearing integration or anything like that. So today I see
Yeah.
that part of our problem, like last night I told you I went to the Nabo boat ride. Mary Kramer was one of the speakers, and she said, "This is a really diverse group," because I think you and I have talked about it. I've talked to it with Bud over at the Whitney. Many times, wherever I go, I'm either the only African American or one of few, or it's all African American. I don't see much true social integration
Right.
here, and I think that's a problem. I've lived in Atlanta. You don't have that same kind of harsh segregation.
Yeah, that's an interesting observation. So let's go back to the '60s a bit.
Okay.
But this is all very very good and very relevant. Do you have your family, your peer group? Do you have any recollection of what actually was happening? And I guess I'm just personally curious is, did it come as a big surprise? I mean, did it come out of nowhere, or not?
Well, I think there are two answers to
Yeah.
that. So I think first, it did not come out of nowhere because, as I said, there were increasing tensions between the police and African Americans. There was also another tension that when you think about the fact that there were many African Americans who were not many, but some who were professionals who had wealth. And then Detroit was unusual, I think, because a factory worker who would be considered an unskilled laborer, if that person were willing to work hard, he would own a home, he owned a car, he could put his children through college. There was Wayne State. So it was a place where it appeared that in some levels we might be doing better than in other communities. But on the other hand, and I didn't look this up, sorry, but there was not much political representation. It was before the era of Coleman Young and the other black mayors. So I think that there was probably a tension of not really being fully allowed to participate in the policy making, and as I said, there were tensions with the police. I was in Africa at the time, in Ghana, with the Experiment in International Living, and this was the time when other riots were taking place, like in Newark and other places, Watts. And I remember my little group said, did I think that would happen in Detroit? And I said, oh, absolutely not, because most people have this house, car. So personally, it was not expected, but I think if I looked back and analyzed it, there were a lot of tensions. Of course, there were more things were beginning to move out of the city. So when you had Northland and sort of the migration and the suburban malls and things like that. So I think there were a lot of tensions and frustrations. And I think, again, and unfortunately it's still going on today, the police brutality just sparked, it was like lit a match. And people, so you had some people living well, you had others in tenements, and very little prospects for any employment or education. So we can see, and then one of the things that became increasingly a problem were drugs, which, when I was really like in elementary school, nobody heard of people being hooked on drugs that much. And so there were all these things being introduced. So I think it wasn't, maybe it wasn't, oh, this is going to necessarily happen, but it wasn't a total shock.
So you weren't here. How did you first find out about it, and do you recall how it was expressed to you?
Yeah, I believe I believe it was through a long-distance call with my family, and at the time, my father had a store, as I said, in southwest Detroit. And I remember that he and my brother were spending the night at the store, armed, because at the time, I think one of the other impacts of the riots was not just white flight, but the destruction of so many neighborhood businesses.
Right.
Some were saved if they wrote sole, but that didn't necessarily protect uniformly. So a lot of our communities were actually destroyed. So growing up on Boston, our cross street was what was then called 12th, now Rosa Parks, lined with businesses, mostly African American and Jewish, but predominantly African American. Drugstores, barbershops, liquor stores, a local 5 and 10, dime store, and different things. So I remember when my father ran for the Constitutional Convention, he didn't have any official party endorsement, but his strategy was we went to about 8 Black Baptist churches, and we walked into every store on 12th Street for a multi-block area, and as I said, he was elected. But so there was a vibrant community there, in addition to the ones that are more publicized right now, like Paradise Valley,
Yeah.
and that was all, destroyed. And I think the tensions really grew, and people were struggling, like, what should they do? So one solution was New Detroit. Another was the Renaissance Center. So there were these attempts, like, how do we bring people back together? And there was fear. I mean, I wasn't here, but one of my good friends, her father was a judge, and she lived on the corner of Boston and 14th. And I was told, he had the the reserve in front of their house. So there was a lot of fear, and some people sent their families to the suburbs to a motel or hotel while they guarded the property.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So what do you think we've learned from that experience, and do you have any thoughts about what we can do as a community going forward?
Mm-hmm. I think one of the most important things we have to do is increase the interaction and dialogues among people from different communities. I still really feel I'm not as immersed in the community as if I hadn't ever left it, but I still feel it's very segregated. And recently we were working, my company was working on a project that required interviewing both Hispanics and African American young people and adults. And what struck me was when we were trying to identify like leaders in the Hispanic community that could then introduce us to Hispanic youth. In asking some of the African American leaders, they really didn't have the same kind of relationships that you would think with the Hispanic leaders. They knew all the African American contacts,
Yeah.
but not such strong. I mean, they could tell you the names, but they couldn't necessarily say, "Oh, just call X."
Right.
So I really think, and then the Chaldean community is very strong here. I think sometimes that's kind of overlooked or very separate. And there are just there are other communities, Polish people who've been here a long time. And I really think there needs to be more interaction. So that was one of the things, one of the co-chairs for this project. I'm very interested in seeing how we can have a formal way of encouraging more multicultural dialogues and relationship building. Because my experience in life has been often being one of the few or integrating, particularly educational institutions. I started a program that's still in existence at the Museum of Modern Art, the Friends of Education, that has done a lot to integrate African Americans in MoMA and participating on the committees, et cetera. But so I find that when people talk to each other and get to know each other, that relationships are built and respect emerges. And I just think we don't have enough of that in a systematic way yet in Detroit. And so if you don't, when people don't know each other, there's suspicions, there's stereotypes, there's the unconscious bias. So that's got to be changed.
Yeah, no, I would agree with you. I mean, it's you've got to expand the sphere of conversation
Mm-hmm.
because probably like you, in a lot of times I spend a lot of time preaching to the converted. And I tell the story that I did a presentation at Macomb Community College on M59 in Hall Road out there, and as I said, if anyone thinks that the world revolves around Woodward Avenue in Midtown, you're greatly mistaken.
Right.
Because it's just such a difference. And these were young students, so they were younger, but it was just a really eye-opening experience to see the lack of knowledge or interest or ability to interact.
But I am encouraged because I have a son who went to Stanford, and what I have found with him and many of his friends is like a little United Nations, more
Sure.
openness. So I think there's a willingness, and in a survey we recently completed of young people, and we asked the question, how important is diversity to you when you're selecting a university? And almost all of them said very important, and they appreciate we're living in a global world where you've got to learn how to relate to
Right.
all different types of people.
That's certainly been my experience with having that 21-year-old daughter too.
Yeah.
You know, which is great.
Yeah,
you know,
that is
which
good.
is great. And
Mhm.
she's to digress for a moment. We're very pleased to say that she's accepted a job here in Detroit.
Oh, good.
And she can't wait to find a place to live in Detroit. But,
Okay.
in any case, any other thoughts you want to add, or anything else? You know, you've said, I tell you, you've said a lot of good things that can be extracted for different purposes. You know, particularly about the sense of community and your advice for moving forward, I think, is a really key part of this. But anything else you'd like to add?
No, except to say that I think for the museum, we're really at a crossroads where by taking and telling this story well and also integrating it into a plan of how it is going to be not just observing history, but using history to shape a better future. I think that's going to be a national model because we're not alone with some of the problems we face. Okay.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.